Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Robert F. Schut. We are back with installment 23 of Soren Kierkegaard's Works of Love. Bob will be leading the discussion today. I was traveling last week, so it is his turn. And this might be the penultimate episode if we are industrious enough, and I can cover chapter 10 and he can cover the conclusion next week. We'll see how everything sorts out. But today, Bob is fully in control, so I'll hand the reins over to him. Oh, by the way, don't forget to download the Noetic app.
That's very true. Very true. Today we're doing section 9, entitled "The Work of Love in Remembering One Dead." I guess this is kind of appropriate for the Halloween season here, isn't it, Luke? The Day of the Dead.
I don't celebrate that holiday anymore, Bob. I'm a changed man. That's the devil's day.
Oh, yes, I agree with you, my friend. But it's kind of an interesting episode. It's kind of really different how he brings this out. Today we're going to talk about how to measure true love, repayment of love, free love, faith is kind of the sequence that he takes us through here. It took a while. I had to actually go through it and then kind of go back over it again and say, how did he get here from there? And actually, I was seeing that he actually brought us through different relationships that we have with one another and how to examine them. And the problem he brings out, before I even reference my notes, the problem that he brings out is when you're in a love relationship, there's such a dynamic between the two that it's hard to isolate one from the other so that you can really evaluate the love of one person and clearly see it. And see, he talks about it, I think, a little bit like a dance couple. If you see two people dancing, the dynamic between the two of them, it's hard to really determine one dancer skill from the other dancer until you see them dance solo, and then you can evaluate them better. But we'll kind of get into that as I go through my notes here. He starts out saying that when a person doesn't understand something complex, they break it down into something very simple. That's kind of the general way that we do things in study. If you can't understand the complexity of an issue, you break it down into its component parts. He says that death is the briefest summary of life. He's going to make comparisons about death, and he kind of uses as a litmus test. But it's going to take a little while to see how he develops this. When you're confused about the multiplicity of life, go out among the dead is his suggestion. And this is where everything seems to come together for him. By visiting the dead, he means to literally go out to a cemetery and sit there and meditate and think about your life among the dead. This is where we find out how we are really related to one another, and that we have one thing in common. At least the very one thing is that we're all going to die. And this brings life into a much better perspective. I don't know. I've never really done that, Luke. Gone to a cemetery. Have you ever done that? Literally
yeah, I actually just did it last week. It's actually, this sounds really macabre, but it's actually one of my favorite things to do. I visited my grandparents' cemetery, and I had not been there, I don't know, since the 90s.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I get a lot, and it's very strange. Why would I say it's one of my favorite things to do? And I think Kierkegaard actually primed me to appreciate cemeteries. I was going to mention that what you're going to cover today, if memory serves me correctly, nicely correlates to an essay he wrote in his book, 3 Discourses on Imagined Occasions. And there's an essay in that called At a Graveside that I believe, if you check the Noetic app or YouTube or whatever, I believe CJ, myself, and Matt Brake covered this. I think this might have been pre-Bob or contemporary.
Yeah, it was. I remember you doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. And these are going to address some of the themes. What I really enjoy about going to cemeteries and things like that is that I like being reminded of my mortality because then that makes me more industrious. And then I also appreciate secondly, I appreciate the equality before death, you know, like, and I think you'll cover some of this about how we are truly equals in death.
Yeah.
And then finally, there are a lot of things that are revealed in death. If you go, I won't go into this too much because it'll make me look weird, but if you go to cemeteries, there are a bunch of, not all the headstones are the same. Some of them are really irregular. And those irregular headstones are very revealing of certain people's allegiances. And I'll just leave it at that. Yeah. So people probably don't pick up on that, but some of the more unusual headstones are symbols.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so sometimes the person who's buried doesn't get to pick out their headstone. It may be more indicative of the people who buried them than the buried.
Yeah, that's true too.
But he says to go out early in the morning when the shadows are there. You know, you have the more intense shadows, elongated, and maybe even more depth. It gives it a lot more depth to the picture. The birds are singing, and you almost forget that you're among the dead. So it sounds like he's almost on a picnic here. I wouldn't doubt that Kierkegaard did go on a picnic or two to the gravesite. And he says, truly you find equality among the dead. Everybody's got about the same size plot, maybe a few different feet different, but for the most part, they're the same, other than different headstones, but they're not all that exotic unless maybe you went to some real wealthy cemetery. Most of the places are going to be pretty much the same. Even those who live in luxury are limited in death by more than the way they were limited in life. And what I think what he's getting at here is that in death, there's only so elaborate you can be, but in life you could be much more elaborate. I know some people have been buried in Mercedes or something like that, buried in their cars and something like that. But he's not talking about such extravagances here. He says that one person might have a tree and the other doesn't. You know, one person maybe is buried by a stream and another person isn't. But they're all pretty much the same. In childhood, there was still a great difference between us. Even when we grew up, there were differences between us. You know, I guess from a wealthy neighborhood, you would have bigger, better toys than the poor person. But in death, all that kind of breaks down and there's a lot more equality. And interestingly, and I'm sure you already know this, Luke, so I'm not telling you anything, the name Kierkegaard actually means graveyard.
Yeah, churchyard, yeah.
Yeah, churchyard, graveyard, yeah. And he says that here we are in a quiet solitude that gives us the context of our life. How is it that a book about love, he said, should speak about death? That's supposed to be works of love here, and here we are at a cemetery. They seem to be incompatible. But he says love is a relationship between two people. But it's hard to observe the individual because there is a dynamic that's going on between both the lover and the beloved that prevents us from isolating one from the other. So it's like I was saying about the dance couple, you know, it's hard to see what one person would really look like alone without having one person stop dancing so the other person could do a kind of solo. So we have to be able to examine the individual and see how the other affects our observation. So the only person who can make himself a nobody to enable us to do this is a dead person. So he wants to examine us in a relationship with the dead in order to see more closely, more carefully, what our love really looks like. So in a relationship between the living and the dead, we can observe the living individual much better. So he says our duty is to love others. We must love those whom we see as well as those whom we do not see, which would be the dead. And then he quotes the book of Sirach, weep softly over one dead, for he has found rest. And so I know we talked a little bit about the book of Sirach, and it's interesting he's not quoting the Bible here. He quotes from another book, which is, yes?
Oh, yeah. Well, I really like, by the way, I really like that passage because I like the idea of not waking the dead. It gives new meaning to the expression in this context. But I was wondering, since you're the learned theologian, can you give some background on Sirach? Am I even saying it right? Sirach?
Well, I would say if it's Hebrew, it's going to be Sirach. So he quotes from this book of Sirach, which is also called the Book of Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes. Wait,
so Sirach is not I'm confused. It's not. This isn't Solomon's Wisdom, is it, or is it the same book?
I'm not sure if Solomon's Wisdom. There's the Book of Wisdom. This is Sirach was a well, I think I have it in my notes here.
You keep going. I'm going to look it up.
Okay, but the names that I have here was the Book of Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus. It's considered to be apocrypha, which means well, I'll get into that in a minute. It has been accepted by some ancient theologians such as Clement, Origen, Augustine, but Jerome did not consider it canonized, did not consider it as passing the test of inspired scripture. It's dated about 200 BCE. It's considered to be deuterocanonical by the Catholics in 1546 and by the Orthodox. What deuterocanonical means, we have a canon, which is the first canon would be considered most of the books that both the Protestants and the Catholics agree are inspired by God to be scripture. The Deuterocanon is what it says. It's the second canon, which is a lower level of not quality, but of authority, a lower level of authority, which is inspired to a point, but something that can help us, give us wisdom, but not something from which we can deduce doctrine. The Anglicans and the Jews don't accept it as even deuterocanonical, but Anglicans think that it could be useful to read. So we have a variety, and I'm bringing this up because we have a variety of opinions on where it really sits. This means that the authorities did not accept it fully as divinely inspired. And canon really means that these were books that were chosen by men of the church, believers that had different levels, bishops, and they made this decision which books they considered. But also, you have to understand, it wasn't like one meeting. It would be misleading to think that a whole bunch of old men got together and decided, okay, this is going to be in the Bible, this isn't. This was an evolution. This took place right from the very beginning. Which books were read by the churches and which books lasted, which books inspired people. And so the canon really formed itself. And the men, the bishops, maybe they weren't all old men, but usually they were pretty much. They just decided, let's just say this is the canon and we're going to close the canon. These are the authorized books and let's just call it quits here. These are the good books. There's no reason to add any more to it. So as they closed the canon more than they really chose the canon, this is kind of a misleading thing that a lot of people like to capitalize on to say, well, the Bible is just picked out by a bunch of men. It's not really. The church formed the canon for years. And I myself, people ask me, well, what do I think? Should this book be in the canon? Shouldn't it be? As I've read a lot of Apocrypha myself, and I've read Deuterocanonical, I've read a lot of Gnostic writings, I think they got it right, to be honest with you. I haven't read anything in the Bible that I say, no, this book doesn't belong in the Bible. And I haven't really read anything outside the Bible that I would have said, yeah, you missed it, you blew it, this belongs in the Bible. So I would say, in my opinion, they got it right. Not everybody might agree with me, but I have no problem with what they chose.
I got some questions. I got some stuff to say.
Oh, good.
Okay, so just for everyone that's playing at home, So the full title of Sirach is the Book of the All Virtuous Wisdom of Joshua ben Sirach, or it's commonly called the Wisdom of Sirach, or simply Sirach. And that is in contradistinction with what I was saying earlier about the Wisdom of Solomon or the Book of Wisdom. So not to get those confused. And just to add on to what Bob said, this was written by the Jewish scribe Ben Sira of Jerusalem. So for a little bit more information, I have read the Book of Wisdom. I've not read Sirach here. Sirach, I can't say the name. I'm getting it all wrong. But what's interesting is that Kierkegaard does quote from the Book of Wisdom so much, or the Wisdom of Solomon, that I thought, oh man, I really have to learn this. I have to know what it's all about. And I listened to it, and I thought to myself, oh, okay, I understand why this didn't make the canon. Specifically because it seems to focus a great deal on enlightenment, and it seems to intimate that at least the first, I've only read it once, it seemed to me that it was feminizing the Holy Spirit by talking about wisdom as like Sophia. Do I have this right? Is that what you recall? So I could see how that could create confusion in terms of doctrine. Now, the other Apocrypha texts that I've read, Enoch, and I'm halfway through Yasher. I don't know. I find these to be really riveting. You were talking about earlier about if you think they got it right or wrong or not. I don't know. I find that Enoch and Yasher fill in a lot of really interesting details. But I know you're very skeptical of Yasher, and you probably have your reasons for not liking Enoch. Everybody's got to use the Holy Spirit for discernment on these things. And I'm not some trained theologian, but I find them interesting. I thought I would just weigh in there.
I think that there's wonderful excerpts from Enoch and from the Book of Wisdom, as Kierkegaard did, that are worth quoting. They're beautiful pieces that are in there. And I guess the problem is when you take it as a whole, a lot of the Apocrypha are stories like this that are obviously fantasy. At least they're obvious to me as fantasy. And so I really don't think that they belong in Scripture. It would give the illusion that Scripture is fantasy. So it's very difficult to keep it apart. But the books are there. I mean, so that's okay. So I don't understand why people would be up in arms about it. The books are there. If you want to read Bell and the Dragon, go for it. Go read it. It's available. Because some of us feel it doesn't belong as fully inspired for teaching, shouldn't bother anybody.
How would you describe Sirach? What's the tone of it?
I haven't read the whole book. So I've read excerpts from it, and I found some of them were very much prophetic about the Messiah, and those parts I feel are really worth reading. I know other parts kind of drone on, and you're not. It's not really very exciting reading. So
yeah,
that's
about it. Before our last session, I'll read it and I'll weigh in and give my opinion on it. So why don't you proceed with your lesson?
Okay. So now he says, okay, back to love. He says, no one can make himself a nobody as good as a dead person can. I think that's obvious. We have to remember the dead. Well, let's see here. This was from the Psalm of Solomon. It says that we must remember the dead and weep softly and long. It's from the Psalm of David. When we have this sense toward the dead, our bankruptcy of human feeling is never more complete than in this relationship. So page 320, a little excerpt here from 320. On truth. So, okay, he says, one means what he says and one means it at the time he says it, but the one satisfies himself in the passion of his uneducated feelings by giving expression in speech, which binds in such a way that rare is the man who by later expression does not render the first untrue, although it is, at first, it was true. So what he's kind of saying here, and it's kind of caught my eye, he's saying that our knowledge is really, our knowledge of truth is really fleeting. It's temporary, it's uncertain. We're fallible. But hopefully we learn from these errors. And I know you and I were just talking earlier about how do we determine truth? It's really a great question. Certainly not going to cover it here and now, but it's an interesting question. What's our criteria of truth, and how do we determine it? And as we kind of decided between ourselves, are we even capable of deciding what is true and what is not true? And is this really what's behind the whole idea of Jesus proclaiming himself as the truth? That truth was something really beyond man. At least truth in this sense, truth in spiritual sense. We're so capable of being, we're so fallible that how can we ever trust that what we think is true is really absolutely true? Right.
Right. And if anyone's just joining us right here, and that's the first time they've ever heard us say that, Kierkegaard does a great job of distinguishing between objective and subjective truth, and that this objective truth about sort of the nature of reality, be it metaphysics or empiricism or the just state or whatever, that these are constantly in flux. These are approximations, and that they're never really fully formed, and that they can shift as a result of new discoveries and societal conditions. So what that leaves us with, the only stolid and supportive truth that we have, is the bond that we have between ourselves and Jesus Christ.
Yeah. You know, one of the funny thing is, well, I used to live in San Diego, and I originally lived in New Jersey. And so there was nothing as stable as the ground, you know. You thought the ground was something you walked on, it was stable, something you could depend upon. But when I got to San Diego, I realized that wasn't true. We had earthquakes there all the time, and it's just a weird feeling to feel the ground wave, to feel waves come through the ground. And you realize that the ground wasn't as solid and permanent as you thought all along. And it's kind of that same thing. Things that we think are truth, all of a sudden something happens in our life, and we realize what we kind of pinned ourselves to is no longer as solid as we thought it used to be, and it's kind of an uncomfortable feeling.
You just described my my intellectual development of 2017.
So he says here, unselfish love. He says it must eliminate the possibility of repayment, and this is exactly what happens when we love the dead. So here he's going to begin to give us an example of how he's going to bring the dead into this whole thing here. It's not really as morbid as it sounds. It's just to let you know ahead of time. So if you want to see, is our love really unselfish? He says, well, if you had a selfish love, you would always expect a repayment. I'm going to love you as long as I get something back for it. But what are you going to get back from the dead? So it's going to be that litmus test of unselfishness. Are you really unselfish? Do you love the living like you love the dead? If we can love the living in the same manner that we love the dead, it would be unselfish. But repayment can be varied. And he calls this the pagan way of loving, where payment is expected in return. He said there is a payment, though, a repayment, which is homogeneous with love, meaning that it doesn't really offend love. And he calls it requited love or requited love. I'm not sure. Which is the correct pronunciation on that? Requited love, I think is the way I've heard it pronounced.
I know something. Let me just see how it flows off the tongue. I know something about unrequited love. Yes.
Unrequited.
Unrequited.
Okay, I had a 50% chance, and I took the wrong 50. Okay, such love has an appropriate response to it. When parents, we talked about parents earlier, when parents love children, they love them even before they exist as non-beings. But parents have an expectation when they love their children. They have a hope. It's kind of a hope of a repayment. My children are going to be brilliant. They're going to be president. They're going to be famous people. They're going to be wealthy. They're going to be movie stars. This is what parents think about their children. Of course, disappointment comes about when they hit their teenage years. Usually, I'm sure I disappointed my parents, but that's just evolution.
Don't count me out yet, Bob. I still may make my parents proud.
I didn't mean you. He says, but the dead make no repayment. It is a thankless job to remember the dead. There's little joy in remembering the dead. So we don't even really get joy, because what can a dead person bring to us? There's no expectation of repayment, of even joy. It's almost like loving no one at all, he says. The good child does not cause sleepless nights, like the bad child, I guess. But the good child doesn't cause sleepless nights. It is the one who is dead who causes sleepless nights. Okay, this is a little twist here he gives us here. Perhaps he's talking about the guilt here, or the regret that we have, or remorse at the times that we had with the dead before they were dead, as times that were misspent, times that were wasted. We think after the person is dead, we could have done so much more, but we didn't. We squandered opportunities. I'm not sure if that's what he wanted, that's what he was trying to say here, but that's how I took it. I don't know if you reflected upon that as much as I did, but did you think about that at all? What he meant by that verse about the good child doesn't give us sleepless nights, but the dead do?
Yeah, but I mean, a good dead child would give me a sleepless night as well.
Yeah.
I mean, think about what a good child brings to you, right?
Yeah.
If you've got this good living child, they become an extension of yourself. It's something that you take pride in, and maybe they eclipsed all the achievements that you set out for them, and maybe they make you look really good. You can brag about them. My son is president. My son is an NFL quarterback.
Yeah.
And if that were suddenly taken away, I can imagine from a father's perspective, if your identity starts to be bound up in the accomplishments of your son in a good way, I can imagine that would cause a lot of sleeplessness as well. But I understand his point. I'm probably overanalyzing it. But I understand.
No, I don't think so. I think you're clarifying it, really, Luke. I think that was well done. In a love relationship with the living, there's always a hope of repayment. But this isn't true when you have a love relationship with the dead. There is no hope of repayment. This is why it's so hard to see what unselfish love is with the living. Because we're always getting something back. Well, we always have an expectation of something happening in return. You say, I love you. The other person responds, I love you too. So there's always that hope, that expectation in which might be considered selfish love to a point. But how unselfish is it? What if the other person doesn't respond and say, I love you? Do you still really and truly love the other person? So this is what he's trying to get at here. Okay, now we have, let's see, page 322, another heading here that we enter into.
While you're looking that up, Bob, I just want to compliment you on your shirt.
Oh, thank you. I thank you with a question mark.
The collection of Hawaiian shirts that you have is dazzling. I'm envious.
As I am with your T-shirt collection. Okay. The work of love is remembering one who is dead is a work of the freest love. Interesting. So we go into this idea about free love. So he talks here now, enters into about free love. Now, anybody who's lived through the 60s knows what hippie love is. If they've gone to Woodstock, the idea of free love, that is definitely not what he's talking about here. He's talking about free love in a different sense. When you have a relationship with one who is dead, there is no interference, so that one can have free love. So it's free of any interference from the dead. So how free is our love when we love the living, is what he's trying to ask. So we need to develop this a little bit between you and me, Luke. What do you think about the free love he's talking about? Did I get it right, you think?
Run it by me one more time.
Well, it's the freedom to love without interference from the other living party. So when we love someone who's dead, there is no interference. It's just us loving them. So it's free. It's free from.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I see what it can't be perturbed. It's pure. It's
excellent way to put it.
That's what you mean by free. Okay.
Yeah.
I can go. I'll go with that.
Okay. The person in the grave is more helpless than the child. Obviously, I mean, there's nothing that the person in the grave, nothing you can do. They're totally helpless. The dead do not cry like children. They don't take from you like the panhandler does. In other words, there's none of this interference. They're silent and they won't say a word and don't inconvenient the living. Sometimes the living are an inconvenience, obviously, right? But the dead are not an inconvenience. You can leave your child with a babysitter so that you don't have to listen to them cry. You want to go to the movies. You need a babysitter, so you get a babysitter. But you don't need to do that with the dead. You don't need to hire a babysitter to watch the dead. You know where they're going to be. You know they're not going to be leaving anytime soon. The dead don't have authority over us. He says that there's a lot of talk about having love that's free. He says that love cannot be free if it's obligated. So when we have an obligation, our love isn't free. We have to kind of respond to them. Maybe in a sense of marriage, I'm trying to search my mind to think of an obligation. Well, even as a parent, there's an obligation to love. There's an obligation to love in a marriage. Even in a friendship, there's an obligation. One who is dead does not obligate or compel. So those are two other words. Free love does not obligate us, nor does it compel us to love. When the dead crumble away, so do the memories. It says, is this free love? Is it true about the saying that we have, out of sight, out of mind? Interesting that Dane, and he lives in Denmark, speaks Danish, and out of sight, out of mind is such an American expression, and I'm wondering that it's a transliteration here or an actual translation, that other cultures have the same expression, out of sight, out of mind. I know I'm learning that that this is true, that a lot of expressions I'm finding out from my wife are European expressions as well as American expressions. So it's kind of an education for me. Yeah. The power of time is great in that it steals away our lives. Life becomes very compressed when we get older. And we see, and this is so true for me. We see our life in a very compressed time, and we realize how quickly it got away from us. I realized how short it was when I was a teenager. How short my life has been since when I retired in 2001, I'm thinking it's just a little while ago. And that when I think about it, it's 16 years ago. 16 years have gone by. And I just can't believe it. It's just so incredibly short. It seems so incredibly short for me. So that's a warning for you, Luke, as you get older.
Oh,
Don't let life get away from you, my friend.
That's why I've got to take a 2 to 3 week hiatus. I gotta live, Bob. But yeah, no, I think about it a lot too. I mean, we just had the 16-year anniversary of September 11th, and that's a lot of time. That's not a lot of time at the same time. And the way that I view things right now, I'm not, you know, my sense of scale has totally changed. Like I'm thinking about 6,000 years of biblical history, and you know, as I get deeper into the Bible and these stories and things like that, I feel like I'm communing with these individuals, and in a sense, you know, like Noah's flood doesn't seem that long ago, right? Or like
Yeah.
or even the garden, or even Adam's sin doesn't really even seem that long ago. It seems, if you have a compressed sense of time, you're like, oh, I understand why I'm still paying for the sins of my father, my first father, Adam. I understand why original sin's there. So my head's all warped. I'm not really thinking about it in terms of a normal person. But if I think on that timeline, 16 years, 6,000 years, it doesn't really seem like very much.
Yeah. Just imagine what it seems like for God, who's eternal, for the divine mind. Yeah, our
like
existence. That. Yeah, absolutely. It says that the dead cannot do a single thing to put us under captivity, to make us captive. So no love is as free as the work of love, which remembers one who is dead. So you want to have free love? Love the dead. Okay, page 325. The work of love in remembering one dead is a work of the most faithful love. Now we look at love from a faithful point of view. How do we test to see if love is faithful? We tested it to see if it was free. Now we're going to test it to see if it's faithful. We have to eliminate everything to see if the object can aid him in being faithful. So we don't want to have any objects of faith, of love here, if we're going to be truly faithful here. If love still abides, it is the most faithful love. All this is absent in the dead because there are no objects with the dead. That I'm thinking that what he's getting here is that we tend to focus upon objects more upon the faith, objects of love, almost idolatry, not quite idolatry, but you know what I'm getting at. We idolize love, especially the things in our love. But with the dead, there are no objects. But I imagine that there are, in a certain sense, just kind of thinking now, we do kind of keep relics, which remind us of the dead. And in a sense, that may take away from our faithfulness to love the dead directly. We kind of love the dead indirectly. And that may take, that's why God really doesn't want us to dabble with relics, because they take away from faithful love. Okay, that's kind of, what do you think? You know, that just came to me now. So what do you think about that? Get an opinion on that idea.
You know, I don't know if I have any. You know, I do have one. I just did this trip, and I brought back from my trip to Ohio. I brought back my grandmother's Bible, and I found some notebooks of hers that she wrote her Bible lessons, and I didn't even know she was that educated. So this is like an epiphany for me. I haven't opened the box since I got yet, but I don't really have any relics of the dead. So I can't really commentate if it's bad or not. I don't have any urns of ashes anywhere or anything of that nature.
I know that we think of them as remembrances, but I'm wondering if that can get out of control quickly and they become almost like a reincarnation of the person, that we need to kind of be in control of that to make sure that our love is still free when we love the dead, rather than become bound again up with, what does he call it? Get to those words that he used here. Compelling us, or obligation. They bring us maybe back to that kind of a state of mind that we don't want to be in.
Right. I've seen, you know, every once in a while you hear about this with people would create large memorials for maybe a spouse that's passed, or I've seen it even, you know, with animals, with dogs and cats and things like that. People, I don't know if you've ever heard about this, like people like,
oh yeah,
getting their pet stuffed or something like that to kind of remain as some sort of reminder. And I can understand the idea of this being a little slavish, like you're kind of creating some sort of deity in your home that you're constantly paying respect to or whatnot. I don't really have strong feelings on this one way or another. I could see it being a psychological crutch that we need to shed, but you know, I don't consider myself in a position to judge people too much about that issue.
No, and it wasn't the people. It was just the idea that I was thinking that something that we need to be careful about. At least in what Kierkegaard is saying here, free love means no obligation, no compelling. When we talk about faithfulness and love, we try to blame the other person as the one who changed. We always believe we have remained completely unchanged. So this is the kind of the dance that he's talking about. When you're in love with somebody living and something goes wrong, well, who are you going to blame? You're going to blame the other person. Okay, whose fault was it we got? Who, you know, you get divorced and then you tell somebody, what they ask you whose fault it was. You're not going to say, well, it was my fault. You're going to say it was my spouse's fault. They did this, they did that, and so forth. That's just human nature. And that's what he's capitalizing here, is human nature. We tend to blame the other person for the changes that took place. But when you're in love with the dead, you can't do that because there's no change that the dead. You're totally responsible in this relationship. So it's difficult to remain unchanged throughout time. He says we tend to deceive ourselves through our own imagination, which is very true. We deceive ourselves through our imagination. We imagine things are a way in which they really weren't, but it brings satisfaction to us. It helps us to get past them. Like you said, the psychological crutch brings us to use our imagination in that way. Even though it's self-deception, it helps us get past that point. When two are joined in love, each holds on to the other. But there's a third entity called the relationship. This creates the dynamic synergism that he's talking about here, that you have two people in love. It's not just the two. There's actually a relationship that creates a new bond. So it's not like two separate people. They become one. There's a whole new element here that makes it impossible to tear it apart to look at one or the other. But there's no such synergism when you love the dead. It's just you loving the dead. Right. So hopefully we're getting the point of why he's comparing all this to the dead, to isolate the living from the dead. If the living one breaks the relationship, there's only one person to blame, and that's the living person. Okay, on page 326 now, we have to consider that it's not a temporary leaving when we speak of the dead, because we can never get that person back into our world again. When they're dead, they're gone. Their life has ended. I shouldn't say they're gone, but they're gone from our existence. We think that we can say anything about the dead, whatever we wish, because there'll be no answer. We can make promises to the dead that we can't keep. Nobody's going to call us on our promises. When we say to someone that we'll never forget them, there's an implied answer of acceptance. When we say that we'll never forget you, the person kind of tends to romanticize that. You know, the person we're saying it to, they may respond with words, or they may just respond with an action. But there's a response of some kind. But the dead have no such an implied acceptance. If we say to the dead, I'll never forget you, nothing, you don't get anything back again. The one who is dead still does everything to make himself forgotten. He says, which is nothing. And you got to think about that a little bit. So what does the dead person do to become forgotten? He doesn't do anything. And therefore you forget him. Out of sight, out of mind. We must take care with our poetic expressions of the dead, is what he's trying to tell us here. We must learn the strength of the dead in their lack of pride. So now he brings up something positive. Dead have no pride. We should learn that from the dead. And Jesus tells us that we must die to the self in Matthew chapter 16:24, to deny oneself and take up our cross. So there's even this tendency of dying to ourselves or denying ourselves, that we should learn from the dead how to be humble. The work of love is remembering the one who's dead is the most faithful love. And this is what he tells us that we have to practice. So remembering the dead is actually a work of love. And we can learn about our love, our ability to love, so to speak, by loving the dead. We can see the kind of love that we have for the dead and measure that against the kind of love we have for the living. We should love the living in the same way that we love the dead. How? Well, disinterestedly, freely, and faithfully. This is a lesson on how to test our love. We can't blame the dead and therefore should not blame the living. We don't expect things from the dead and should not expect things from the living. We're not coerced by the dead and therefore should not be coerced by the living. So these are kind of like three things in summary of what we've discussed. So we should learn from our love for the dead. We must eliminate all excuses as to why we are so selfish. When we're selfish, we should accept it as our own selfishness. It's our duty to love those whom we do not see, as well as those whom we see. And there's a quote from 1 John that I'll kind of wrap this up in. 1 John chapter 4, verse 20 from the NET version says, if anyone says, I love God, and yet hates his fellow Christian, he's a liar. Because the one who does not love his fellow Christian whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. So the duty of love is eternal.
I see that as being so true. What's interesting is I've gotten deeper into Christian communities, how easy it is to say brother and sister to people that you don't know.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to think about hating a brother or sister. You know, I wanted to ask you a question, and I hope I didn't steal your thunder there. But how do you think, you know, it's not, when people are loving the dead, it's not always sort of this at a graveside sober mentality, contemplating the utter equality of death and the humility of it and everything like that. Some people do think that they are in a dynamic relationship with the dead. I've heard that people talk about, that their mother is watching over them.
Yeah.
Or that they'll talk to a deceased husband or something like that. Now, granted, that's probably part of the grieving process, and that's some sort of comfort. But I mean, where do you think that sort of mentality fits into any of this? I mean,
well, yeah, I think that in our mind, we still have the spirit of the person living. We can't cast out memories or things that we've experienced. We can't cast out experiences like a person dies and all of a sudden all our memories are gone. You know, we can't do that. So we have to accept memory as memory. If we project that into our experiences and try to put, so to speak, flesh on the bones, that may become a problem when we begin to see dead people, speak to dead people. And I don't mean idle speaking that I think is normal to a normal level, but we actually have conversations with dead people. Are we
inviting a familiar spirit in? Is that what we're talking about?
I think that we can take it too far, and that we can become deceived, and we can become vulnerable to deception. And I think that we take away from the living thoughts that we should be having, love that we should be having for the living. We might be taking away from the living and putting them on the dead person. You know, a person who has to visit a gravesite every day. You know, you're taking time away from the living to visit the dead. And Jesus even says to one of the people who comes, he says, "Come and follow me." And he says, "Okay, Jesus, but first I have to go bury my father. Then I'll come back and bury you." And Jesus says, "Let the dead bury the dead." So I would say that would be my answer. Let the dead bury the dead. They're dead. We can still love them, but we don't want to become turning into an obsession. We have to live while we're still living.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to say in conclusion, or
that pretty much? Yeah, that was my conclusion. The last sentence I have, I'm not sure it got through. It says, "The duty of love is eternal." So love is an eternal thing. We can't cut love off from the dead. It's eternal. We're going to love the dead. But we have to remember we have to love the living. And that's where we are. We're among the living. So.
Well, right on. Thank you so much, Bob. And next week, hopefully, this will be our last session. We might break it into two, depending on how complex the topic is. And then it is Bob's choice for what book we cover next of Soren Kierkegaard. So choose wisely, my friend. We'll probably be with it for 6 months.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe a short. Yeah, maybe we should do some shorter ones to get some variety. But I'll let you decide. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening. I'll edit this and get it up on YouTube and SoundCloud and the Noetic app ASAP. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, remember, all comments are welcome.
Yes, definitely. philosophyluke@gmail.com. And your email, Bob?
Yeah, rshut@sbcglobal.net.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.